They said she never spoke a word. Not when they chained her, not when they took her children, not even when they begged her to confess. But the question no one dared to ask was why. Why did the woman they called the silent giant choose silence over screams? Why did the men who owned her fear the sound of her voice? And why, when she finally did speak, did the town priest leave Alabama the next morning and never return? Tonight, we uncover what she whispered before she died, and the truth buried beneath the plantation soil that no one was ever meant to hear. They called her the giant, but even that word felt too small. The first record of her arrival appears in a crumbling ledger from 1852, in the margins of a slave trader's book, beside the price of 2 oxen and a barrel of tobacco. Female, tall, mute, age uncertain, no name, no history, no origin. Just that, tall, mute, female. Her body was her only description, her silence, her only crime. She arrived in Alabama during a summer when the air felt like boiling oil, when the cotton fields shimmered white against the burning sun, and when the scent of decay hung behind every barn. She was led off the wagon by chains, her back straight, her eyes vacant. People said she looked like she'd been carved out of stone. From the beginning, there was something unsettling about her stillness. Most new arrivals cried, screamed, begged, prayed. She didn't. When the overseer whipped a man beside her, she didn't flinch. When the slave trader spat on her shoes, she didn't blink. She simply looked past them, as if her eyes were seeing something far away, something only she could see. The plantation hands whispered that her silence was a curse, that she had made a vow across the ocean to never speak the language of her captors. The white men called her broken. The other enslaved people called her holy. Her new owner, Isaac Breyer, found her silence fascinating. He liked control, and a woman who refused to speak was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He put her to work in the lower fields, where she picked cotton from dawn to dusk, without complaint. At night, while others sang sorrowful hymns or whispered stories around the fires, she sat alone near the old well, her massive hands folded in her lap, staring into the dark water. Children would sometimes creep near her, daring each other to touch her or speak to her. But when her eyes lifted, they ran because something in her stare carried a weight older than the land itself. Months passed. The men began to notice her strength. She could haul barrels 2 men couldn't lift, drag timber through the mud without rest, carry water longer than any ox. The overseers used her as an example of good breeding stock. That word, stock, followed her like a shadow. Breyer started sending her to the breeding quarters, pairing her with other men without her consent. Each time she obeyed silently, never screaming, never resisting, never speaking. Her belly grew, and when she bore her first daughter, she didn't cry or smile. She simply stared at the child with those same vacant eyes. Her daughters came one after another, 9 in total. Each had her mother's height, her mother's dark, quiet eyes. Each disappeared before reaching 10. The official word was that they were sent to another farm. But the others on the plantation knew better. They never saw wagons leave, never heard of them arriving elsewhere. The quarters would be full one evening and empty the next morning. When the mothers cried, the overseers said, "Ask the giant. She knows." But the giant never answered. She kept working, the same steady rhythm, the same silent breath. Her grief was invisible, or maybe she had learned to bury it somewhere deep, where even God couldn't find it. Years turned to decades. She became part of the land itself, a myth in flesh. The children born on the plantation grew up hearing her story, how she had once been a queen before she was captured, how she had made a vow of silence so her captors couldn't steal her language, how she could curse with a look. But those were stories told by people desperate to make meaning from horror. The truth was more brutal. Her silence wasn't power, it was survival. Every woman who spoke, who protested, who screamed when their children were taken, disappeared. Mara, as one of the old women called her, had seen enough to know that the loudest ones vanished first. Her silence unsettled the master. He prided himself on breaking men with fear, but this woman seemed unbreakable. There was no satisfaction in whipping her. She never cried. No pleasure in humiliating her. She didn't react. She existed beyond his control, and that terrified him. To own someone you could not dominate was to admit that ownership was an illusion. So he punished her in smaller ways. He'd take her daughters under the guise of work. He'd send her to the cellar to clean his private chambers where no one else was allowed. He'd make her watch the auctions. And every time she just stood there silent, her face carved in stone, her eyes reflecting the pain of 1,000 unspoken screams. In the humid air of Alabama, silence could drive a person mad. It pressed against you like heat, thick and relentless. The other women avoided her, not out of hatred, but out of fear that her quietness was contagious. They said she could hear voices in the earth, that at night she knelt by the well and whispered names into the water, names that were never spoken aloud again. And sometimes before dawn they'd hear a deep hum rising from her quarters, low and mournful, like a hymn too ancient to belong to any church. By the 1850s, Breyer's plantation was one of the largest in the county. His wealth came not just from cotton, but from breeding. He sold children, his own and those of others, across state lines. But Mara's daughters were never listed in his ledgers. That absence became its own ghost. It was as if they had been erased before they even lived. New overseers came and went. Each recorded the giant woman's productivity, her silence, her strength. None mentioned her grief. None questioned the disappearances. To question was to risk your position, or worse. One winter, a storm flooded the lower fields. The slaves were ordered to dig trenches through the night. Mara worked until dawn, her feet sunk in mud, her arms slick with rain. When the water finally drained, she didn't return to her quarters. She walked instead to the well, the same well where she had sat for years, and stayed there until sunrise. When the overseer found her, she was holding something wrapped in cloth, a small wooden doll, carved crudely from pine, its face scratched with 9 marks. She placed it at the edge of the well and went back to work without a word. That night, the wind howled so fiercely that the barns rattled, and people swore they heard children crying beneath the ground. After that, no one dared speak her name. Even Breyer avoided her eyes. She moved through the fields like a ghost that refused to die. The others said she was waiting for her children to return, or waiting for the earth to open and swallow the house that had devoured them. Whatever she waited for, it kept her alive long after most had broken. Years later, when the war began and the South trembled, her silence became legend. Men whispered that she knew when death was coming, that she had buried her voice so deep it became part of the soil. The truth is simpler, but far more terrifying. She had seen what speaking did, how it called pain, how it summoned death. Her silence wasn't peace, it was armor. And though the world took everything from her, her body, her children, her freedom, it could never take her silence. It belonged to her alone, and through it, she endured. The plantation lay on the outskirts of Lowndes County, Alabama, a place where the land seemed to breathe misery. The soil was thick and red, the kind that stained skin for days, as if the earth itself refused to let go of what it swallowed. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under the punishing sun, the air heavy with humidity and the stench of sweat, iron, and animal rot. At night, the cicadas screamed loud enough to drown out thought, and during the day, the fields shimmered like a mirage of white gold. It was wealth for one man, torment for hundreds. Isaac Breyer's estate sat at the heart of that land, an old mansion built on a rise that overlooked the fields. From a distance, it looked noble. Tall columns, whitewashed walls, a wraparound porch where the master drank his whiskey at dusk. But up close, the beauty faded. The paint peeled where the rain hit hardest, and the smell of decay seeped from the wooden boards. Beneath the house was a cellar, and beneath the cellar, something older, a stone chamber that predated the plantation itself. The locals said it was built by Spanish settlers who once tried to mine the red clay for iron. Breyer never confirmed it, but he never denied it either. He only smiled when people asked. The plantation was both kingdom and prison. Nearly 100, Enslaved men and women worked there, each one bound to the land through fear. Overseers rode on horseback through the rows, their eyes always watching, their whips always ready. The rules were simple. Work until you collapse, and if you collapse, work harder. Punishments were public, designed not just to break bones, but to crush hope. The screams from the whipping post carried for miles, echoing off the trees until even the birds fell silent. In that place, silence became a form of resistance. It was safer not to speak, not to look, not to feel. The giant, Mara, fit perfectly into that world, though she did not belong to it. Her presence was like a scar against the landscape, too large, too unyielding. The others whispered about her, but never too loudly. She was both one of them and something other, a living reminder of a past none dared to remember. Briar had inherited the plantation from his father, a man rumored to have lost his mind before his death. Some said he heard voices in the cellar, that he spoke to things no one else could see. When Isaac took over, he modernized the estate, doubled production, and gained a reputation for efficiency, a polite word for cruelty. He called his plantation the Promise. To outsiders, it symbolized southern prosperity. To those who worked it, it was hell dressed in white linen. The land itself seemed to hold secrets. The trees grew twisted, their roots gnarled like old, fingers reaching for the surface. The creek that ran behind the fields never stayed clear. It always carried a faint reddish hue, as if washing blood downstream. The enslaved people avoided it at night, saying the water carried whispers, soft, voices begging to be remembered. Even the dogs refused to drink from it. In the main house, Briar kept his own rules. He hosted lavish gatherings, inviting wealthy neighbors to dine, laugh, and exchange gossip, while the enslaved staff served them in silence. The guests often commented on the size of the woman they saw working near the barn, hauling barrels and timber. "A specimen," one man called her. Briar would grin and nod, saying she was his strongest worker, a wonder of nature. What he didn't say was that he considered her more than property. She was part of an experiment. He had grown obsessed with the idea of creating the perfect laborer, strong, silent, loyal. His obsession twisted into something dark, something that turned flesh into formula. The breeding quarters were built on the edge of the property, near the tree line where the land dipped into marsh. The building was disguised as a storage shed, but everyone knew what it was. The sound of chains echoed from its walls at night, followed by cries that faded into silence. That was where Mara was sent again and again. Each birth that took place there was recorded in a secret ledger Briar kept locked in his study. He wrote in small, precise letters, dates, measurements, temperament, health. But Mara's daughters were listed only by number, never by name. After the 9th, the entries stopped altogether. The plantation's workers noticed changes in the air around that time. The fields grew strangely quiet. The overseers avoided the western side of the property, claiming the ground there felt soft, unstable. Some said the earth itself was sinking, swallowing what it had been forced to hold. When one of the plowmen unearthed a fragment of cloth and a small bone, Briar ordered the field burned and replanted. He told the workers that disease had spread. Through the soil, that fire was cleansing. The truth, of course, was simpler and far more horrifying. At night, a lantern could be seen flickering beneath the house in the cellar. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Briar would vanish for hours, and when he emerged, he smelled of smoke and iron. He forbade anyone from entering. Even the overseers were told to stay away. Only one man ever disobeyed, a carpenter named Ellis, tasked with repairing the stairs after they began to rot. He went down one evening and came back pale, shaking, unable to speak. The next morning his body was found hanging in the barn, his eyes open, his hands bruised as if he'd been fighting. Invisible hands. No one mentioned it again. The plantation continued to operate, but something unspoken hung over it. Livestock died without reason. Tools broke. Children grew sick. The air felt heavier. When storms rolled across Alabama, lightning seemed to strike. The same field every time, the one where the earth had been burned. Some said that was where Mara's daughters had been buried. Others said Briar had sealed something beneath the soil that wanted to come back. Mara remained at the center of it all, unchanged, unmoved. Her silence grew heavier, as though it absorbed the pain of everyone around her. The overseers began, avoiding her. The women crossed themselves when she passed. Even Briar, for all his arrogance, stopped looking her directly in the eyes. It was said that once, during a thunderstorm, he caught her standing near the well again, her hands pressed to the earth, whispering. He dragged her inside, demanded to know what she was saying. She didn't answer. He struck her again and again, until she fell to her knees. Still, she said nothing. That night, his youngest daughter woke screaming, claiming to see 9 girls standing in the corner of her room, dripping with water. By the early 1860s, war had begun to spread through the South. Men left for battle, and the plantation fell into uneasy quiet. With fewer eyes watching, secrets began to seep through the cracks. The workers spoke of hearing footsteps in the cellar when no one was there, of seeing shadows that didn't move with the light. The well water turned cloudy, and animals refused to go near it. Briar stopped hosting dinners. He drank alone, muttering to himself, staring at the empty chairs around his table as if waiting for ghosts to join him. The plantation was no longer a place of life. It had become a mausoleum built from greed and silence. Every plank, every stone, every furrowed row of cotton held a memory of pain. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Mara kept working, a living monument to the sins of the man who owned her. Her silence the only sound left that made sense in a world built on cruelty. They said her daughters were born under strange skies, always during storms, as if the heavens themselves resisted their arrival. Each birth was quiet, eerie, almost reverent. No midwife chants, no cries of labor, only the dull hum of thunder and Mara's steady breathing. The other women helped when they could, whispering prayers and wrapping each newborn in scraps of cloth. But even then, something about those children frightened them. They were beautiful, yes, but unsettlingly. Still, their eyes were too dark, too knowing. They rarely cried. They would simply stare, as if already aware that this world was not meant for them. The first daughter was named Elsa by one of the field women, though Mara never called her that. She called none of them anything, at least not in words anyone could understand. She would hum to them in the evenings, soft and low, a rhythm that seemed older than the plantation itself. When Elsa was 6, she was taken to the main house to help with chores. She never came back. Briar's wife said she'd been sent to another estate to serve a family friend, but no wagon had come that night. No one believed the lie, but no one spoke of it either. Silence was protection. The second daughter disappeared 2 years later. The third was gone by her 5th birthday. Each time, the same pattern. The child summoned to the house, the sound of thunder, then nothing. By the time the 6th was taken, even the overseers avoided asking questions. The plantation had learned a rhythm of its own, the arrival of life followed by a hollow absence. The field workers began marking the trees each time one of the girls vanished, carving small symbols into the bark to keep count. By the 9th, the grove behind the quarters looked like a forest of scars. Each disappearance left a mark on Mara's face, though she never wept. Her silence deepened, and her presence grew heavier. She moved slower, as though carrying the weight of all 9 within her. The other women began to whisper that she was cursed, that she had angered some spirit, or made a pact with one. The men stayed away from her, afraid her curse would follow them. But the children still came near her when the overseers weren't watching. They said she could calm fevers just by touching a forehead. They said she could stop bleeding with a look. The truth was simpler. She cared for them like a mother who had lost too much to ever look away again. At night, the children of the quarters would gather around her, and she would trace shapes in the dirt, circles, lines, spirals, while humming in that deep low tone. The others said it was madness, but there was a strange comfort in it. Even the cruelest overseer hesitated to interrupt her. They said the air grew heavy when she hummed, that the night seemed to hold its breath. Briar kept a separate ledger for his special property. That ledger contained only one line for each girl, no names, only numbers. Beside each number were strange marks, part letters, part symbols. He called them his experiment results. He claimed that through controlled breeding, he could create an ideal labor force, silent, strong, unquestioning. He boasted to a visiting friend that the giant's children were proof that nature can be improved. His friend reportedly laughed uneasily, saying, "You're breeding ghosts, Isaac." Breyer only smiled. "Ghosts work harder," he said. But what he didn't understand was that the more he took from Mara, the less of himself remained. The house began to change. Servants spoke of whispers behind the walls, of laughter that didn't belong to anyone alive. The youngest Breyer daughter, only 8, woke screaming one night, saying she saw girls in white dresses standing by her bed. Breyer struck her, calling it nonsense, but afterward, he kept his pistol near his pillow. When Mara's 9th child was taken, the plantation's air shifted completely. A storm came down from the hills, tearing through the cotton fields, flooding the barn and uprooting trees. The sky turned red, as if the sun had bled into the clouds. That same night, workers saw Mara walking barefoot through the rain toward the big house. No one dared follow. Lightning struck near the well, illuminating her figure, tall, unmoving, framed against the burning sky. The next morning, Breyer appeared at breakfast with scratches down his face and a look no one had ever seen before: fear. He ordered the well sealed with stone. He forbade anyone from speaking to Mara. But the damage was already done. The rumor spread that she had gone to the well to call her daughters back. The older women said she had whispered their names into the water, one by one, and that the wind had answered her. After that night, things on the plantation began to unravel. Livestock died mysteriously. Workers found small handprints pressed into the dirt near the cellar, though no children had been there. The air inside the main house grew foul, thick with rot, no matter how many candles were lit. Breyer's wife took to her room, praying constantly, convinced the land had been cursed. But Mara continued as she always had. She worked the fields, carried water, tended to the sick. Her silence became almost sacred. The other enslaved people began to see her not as cursed, but as chosen, a living vessel for something far greater than their understanding. They believed her daughters had not vanished but transformed, that their spirits lingered around her, guarding her. When the overseers beat her for working too slowly, she did not resist. But the next morning, that overseer's horse was found dead, its body twisted, its eyes wide open. After that, no one touched her again. The years passed, and her legend deepened. Some nights, people swore they saw 9 shadows following her, moving just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Some said she spoke to them in her dreams, that she told them what freedom looked like, not the kind written in laws, but the kind buried in the soul. The truth of her daughters became a story the plantation tried to bury, but the earth has a way of keeping memory. When the war began, and the Union soldiers moved through Alabama, they heard the tale of the silent giant and her 9 lost daughters. Some laughed it off as superstition, but one officer wrote in his journal that he'd seen a woman in the fields taller than any man, standing motionless in the rain, her eyes like glass, her shadow divided into 10. Even after the plantation fell, the mystery of those daughters endured. No graves were ever found, no records of sale, no witnesses to their departure. It was as if the land itself had devoured them. But some nights, when thunder rolled across Lowndes County, old farmers swore they could still hear faint laughter rising from the soil, the laughter of 9 little girls, forever bound to the silence of the mother who refused to let their memory die. It began with strange noises beneath the house, faint thuds, a low humming sound, sometimes like a distant heartbeat. The workers heard it first, late at night when the fields were quiet and the overseers had gone. They said it came from the cellar, the one beneath the old smokehouse that had been sealed years ago. The older men warned the younger ones not to go near it. "That's where he does it," they whispered. "That's where the master keeps the ones who can't speak." Isaac Breyer's obsession had grown darker over time. To those who knew him only by reputation, he was a man of intellect and vision, a landowner who talked of progress and prosperity. But within his house, progress meant perversion. He kept notebooks filled with drawings of human forms, measuring limbs, muscle ratios, and birth cycles. He spoke in hushed tones about perfecting the stock, claiming he could engineer a generation of slaves who never rebelled, who never spoke, who never thought beyond their work. His words carried the language of science, but the intent was monstrous. He began conducting his rituals, experiments as he called them, in secret chambers below the cellar. At first, no one knew what he was doing, only that the smell of iron and smoke would rise from the ground on certain nights, and that the windows of the main house would flicker with light long past midnight. His wife had stopped asking questions years earlier. She lived in silence too, but hers was born from fear, not will. The servants noticed her hands shaking when she poured wine, her eyes darting toward the floor whenever her husband entered the room. She knew something was happening. Beneath them, she had heard the muffled cries. She simply pretended not to. One autumn, a new overseer arrived, Thomas Keene, a young Irishman who'd come south looking for work. He was no stranger to cruelty, but something about Briar's estate unsettled him. The air felt wrong, heavy. His first week, he was told to inspect the lower buildings and make repairs. That's when he found the narrow staircase behind the smokehouse, hidden behind a wooden door sealed with rusted nails. Curiosity led him down into the dark. He carried only a lantern and a flask of whiskey. The steps creaked as he descended, and with each one the air grew colder. The walls were slick with moisture, and the smell hit him halfway down, something metallic, like blood, mixed with rotting wood. At the bottom, he found a small chamber, and in it, things that made no sense. Chains bolted into the walls, wooden crates with holes in the sides, large enough for a hand to slip through, scraps of fabric that looked like children's dresses. And on one wall, carved deep into the stone, were words, "All 9 return to me." He ran from that place, shaking, his lantern swinging wildly. When he burst into the open air, he vomited. The next morning, he tried to resign. Briar refused. That night, Keene packed his things and left anyway. But before he could reach town, his horse was found wandering alone on the road. Keene himself was never seen again. The others whispered that the land had taken him too. After that, the cellar was sealed again. Briar forbade anyone from going near it, but the noise didn't stop. Sometimes, late at night, the workers heard the clink of metal, a faint dragging sound, and then the unmistakable sound of a child's laugh, soft and hollow, echoing through the boards. The dogs howled and refused to go near the smokehouse. The air grew foul around it, thick with a smell like burned hair. Briar's behavior became erratic. He stopped attending church, stopped meeting guests. He kept to his study, surrounded by books on anatomy, breeding, and African folklore. He began collecting strange objects, carved talismans, bottles of preserved specimens, even bones. His journals, later discovered in fragments, revealed a mind slipping into madness. He wrote of creating a generation that will not betray me, and of using the giant's blood to make it possible. He believed Mara's silence held power, that something in her, something beyond flesh, could be harnessed. He began calling her the vessel. He summoned her to the cellar repeatedly. No one knew what happened down there, but she would emerge covered in ash, her eyes darker than before. Sometimes she'd stand in the fields afterward, staring toward the house, her body trembling as though resisting some unseen force. The other workers began to believe she was fighting him, not with fists or words, but with silence itself. The plantation grew darker, not just in spirit, but in sight. The crops began to fail, the cotton turning gray before harvest. The soil, once rich, became hard and cracked. Briar blamed the workers, punishing them more brutally than ever. Yet no matter how many were whipped, no matter how much blood was spilled, the land would not yield. He began to mutter that the giant had cursed him. He accused her of poisoning the water, of calling spirits from the well. He had her tied to the whipping post in front of everyone, demanding she confess. She didn't speak. He beat her until the whip handle snapped, but she only looked at him with the same terrible calm. He screamed, "Tell me what you've done!" She said nothing. The others saw something in his eyes then, not rage, but terror. That night, the wind changed. A storm gathered above the plantation, rolling in faster than any man had seen before. Lightning split the sky, striking the tallest tree near the house and setting it ablaze. The air filled with a roar like hundreds of voices crying at once. When the storm passed, the smokehouse was gone. Nothing remained but scorched earth and the smell of wet ash. The next morning, Briar was seen standing in the ruins, his face pale, his hands shaking. He didn't speak for 3 days. The servants said he began hearing them afterward, the voices of the children he'd taken, whispering through the walls. He tried to drown them out with drink, but they followed him. Sometimes he'd wake screaming, claiming that he saw them standing at the foot of his bed watching him. He ordered more nails, more boards, sealed the cellar again, and again the noises returned. As the years passed, his mind decayed completely. He no longer trusted his overseers, accusing them of conspiracy. He dismissed his wife's pleas to leave the estate, calling her hysterical. He stopped eating, stopped bathing, and spent his nights pacing the halls with a lantern, muttering that the girls were in the walls. The plantation rotted around him. Weevils devoured the cotton, the animals starved, the workers fled. Only Mara remained, her silent figure haunting the fields. And then, one night, a scream echoed from the house, one long, terrible sound that cut through the dark. When the workers ran to see, they found Briar standing on the porch, covered in blood. He was babbling nonsense, clutching at his chest, saying the words, "They came back." Behind him, the cellar door was wide open. After that, the house was abandoned. No one ever dared go back down those stairs. Those who did claimed they could still smell iron and hear faint humming. The sound of a mother's silence echoing beneath the ground, where the truth of what he'd done could never be buried deep enough. When the plantation finally fell silent, it was as though time itself had stopped breathing. The once bustling fields of cotton lay untouched. The great house stood hollow and gray, and the air, once alive with the hum of work and the crack of whips, became heavy with the weight of what had been done there. Only crows remained, circling above the charred remains of the smokehouse, calling out as though mocking the quiet below. Locals avoided the property entirely, whispering that the ground itself had turned sour. They said the soil would no longer bear fruit, that every seed planted there shriveled before it could sprout. Some said the land remembered. Others said it hungered. Years later, when new settlers tried to reclaim the property, they found the cellar still sealed, its entrance buried beneath layers of ash and rotted wood. But curiosity has a way of undoing warnings. One of them, a man named Elias Cotter, began clearing the wreckage. He was a veteran of the war, hardened by death, skeptical of ghost stories. He told the locals that fear was a tool of ignorance. That night, when the wind picked up and the trees began to moan, he ignored the sound. He pried open the entrance and went below with a lantern. He was gone for less than an hour. When he emerged, his face was pale, his hands trembling. He refused to speak for 3 days, drinking himself into a stupor at the inn in town. When he finally spoke, all he said was, "They're still there." When pressed, he would only repeat, "The daughters, they're waiting for her." No one could make sense of it, and by the end of the week, Elias packed his things and left the county entirely. The entrance was covered again, and this time, no one dared disturb it. What the townspeople didn't know, what the records would later suggest, was that Isaac Briar's experiments hadn't been entirely physical. Hidden among his writings was evidence of a deeper obsession. He'd been studying not just bloodlines, but old African myths, tales of ancestral spirits who could bind themselves to their descendants, of women who carried within them the power of generations. He'd come to believe that Mara's silence wasn't natural, but sacred. He called it the tongue of the earth. According to his notes, he thought if he could control it, he could command life and death itself. His journals described 9 separate births, 9 daughters, all born of Mara, each taken from her within days. The entries were clinical at first, full of measurements and observations, but by the 5th daughter, the tone shifted. He began writing in fragments, mixing Latin with symbols, scrawling words that barely made sense. They are mirrors. They do not die. They return. By the 9th entry, the handwriting had changed completely, jagged and frenzied. He wrote, "She won't let me have them anymore. She hides them in the earth. She speaks without sound. She breathes through the soil." Historians who examined the fragments later would argue that Breyer had gone mad. But those who lived near the plantation told different stories. They claimed that on certain nights, when the fog rolled low across the fields, you could see shapes moving in the mist, 9 of them, small and slow, walking toward the house. Their steps made no sound. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight. The dogs wouldn't go near the property. Birds refused to sing there. By 1860, the Breyer estate had become a legend. People called it the House of the Silent Mother. Travelers passing through Alabama avoided it, and the few who dared to camp nearby reported strange dreams, visions of a tall woman standing in a field of bones, her face turned toward them, her lips unmoving. One man claimed she spoke directly into his mind, saying only one phrase, 9 for 1, 1 for 9. He left the next morning, leaving his belongings behind. But the story didn't die with Breyer. Decades later, when the land was finally sold off in parcels, workers began to unearth things. Small bones, perfectly preserved, wrapped in fabric that hadn't decayed. The sheriff at the time dismissed it as superstition. Probably animal remains, he said. But the coroner's report, long buried in county archives, noted something odd. The bones weren't animal at all. They were human, and small enough to belong to infants. There were 9 sets in total. The discovery should have sparked an investigation, but the town was tired of the curse. The sheriff sealed the report, the bones were reburied quietly, and no one spoke of it again. Still, those who handled them said strange things began happening afterward. One man's hands developed deep burns where he'd touched the remains, though there was no fire. Another worker claimed to hear whispering in his sleep, the sound of a woman humming an old lullaby he'd never heard before. Within a month, all of them had left the county. Over the following decades, the story of Mara, the silent giant, twisted into myth. Some said she'd made a pact with something older than God, that her silence was the price of her power. Others said she'd never been human at all, but a guardian placed among the enslaved to protect them from the evils of men like Breyer. What they all agreed on was this: her silence was not submission. It was defiance. Every day she refused to speak, she denied him control. Every breath she took was rebellion. In 1912, a young anthropologist named Dr. Lawrence Pike came across the story while studying post-slavery folklore. Intrigued by the recurring mention of the 9 daughters, he visited the region to investigate. Locals warned him to stay away, but Pike dismissed their fears. He camped near the ruins of the plantation and recorded his observations. His journal entries, preserved in a university archive, tell a chilling story. On his 3rd night, he wrote, "There is a rhythm beneath the earth here. It feels alive, like a pulse. When I stand near the old smokehouse foundation, it grows louder." The next entry was written in shaky handwriting. "I saw her tonight. She is tall, impossibly tall, standing in the field. I cannot move. Her mouth is closed, but I can hear her voice inside my head. She is asking where her children are." That was the last thing Pike ever wrote. His body was found the next morning by a local farmer, his face frozen in terror, eyes open wide. His notebook was beside him, pages torn as though by claws. After that, the land was abandoned for good. Trees grew over the ruins, vines consumed the house, and the smokehouse disappeared beneath layers of earth. But on nights when the wind blows, from the south the townsfolk say you can still hear it, a deep humming beneath the ground, steady and mournful. Some call it the sound of grief. Others say it's the voice of a mother still waiting for her daughters to come home. And though the world has moved on, the locals still warn travelers who pass near the old Breyer property. Don't speak her. Name after dark. Don't listen if you hear her hum. And if you see her in the fields, don't run. Just bow your head, stay silent, and pray she keeps walking. By the time the 20th century began to forget the plantation's name, the forest had taken it back. The path that once led to Isaac Breyer's great house was overgrown with kudzu, the fences splintered, and the river had shifted its course, swallowing half the fields where people once bent their backs in the heat. The last map to include the estate had been drawn in 1898. After that, it vanished quietly, the land simply marked as uninhabited. Locals still spoke of it, but only in low voices. They called it the Hollow, as if the place itself had become a wound. In 1924, the state decided to buy the property for agricultural redevelopment. The government sent a team of engineers to survey it, clean-cut men in khaki uniforms armed with notebooks, cameras, and a sense of optimism that would not survive their first night there. The leader was a pragmatic man named Charles Hemphill. He didn't believe in curses or ghost stories. He'd grown up in an era that worshipped science and progress. But even he admitted, after stepping onto that soil, that something about the place felt wrong. "The air," he wrote in his first report, "tastes like rain before it falls. The birds go silent when you walk the lower fields. It's as if the earth is holding its breath." On their second day, while clearing brush near the ruins, the workers found a strange formation, 9 stones arranged in a perfect circle. Each was marked with a crude symbol, and in the center of the circle lay a patch of ground darker than the rest, as though the soil itself had been burned. They thought it might be the remains of a fire pit. But when they dug just beneath the surface, they found fragments of fabric. The pieces were tiny, disintegrating at touch, but the colors were still faintly visible: pink, blue, and white. Children's colors. That night, Hemphill's men drank around their campfire, laughing off the discovery. But one of them, a young man named Raymond Dunn, refused to sit close to the flames. He said he'd seen something near the tree line, a tall woman, watching them. Her face had been hidden, but her outline was unmistakable, impossibly long arms hanging at her sides. The others mocked him, called it moonlight tricks. Still, no one laughed when an hour later the lanterns went out one by one. They relit them quickly, but the horses were restless, snorting and pulling against their reins. Then they heard it, a low, droning hum that rose from beneath the earth, deep and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Hemphill ordered everyone to stay calm. The sound faded after a few minutes, but the men refused to sleep. By morning, 2 of them were gone. Their bedrolls were undisturbed, their rifles still lying by the fire. The only sign they'd been there was a trail of footprints leading toward the circle of stones and stopping dead in the center. There were no prints leading away. The survey was abandoned the next day. Hemphill's official report cited unstable ground and uninhabitable conditions, but in his private journal, found years later among his belongings, he described a nightmare that had followed him home. He dreamed of a woman's shadow leaning over him, whispering words he couldn't understand. When he woke, he found dirt under his fingernails and mud on his sheets. He burned the journal before his death, but 1 page survived, torn and kept by his daughter. On it, in trembling handwriting, were 4 words: "The daughters are awake." For decades after that, no one touched the land again. Trees swallowed what remained of the house, vines covered the cellar door, and even the nearby river changed course, as if nature itself wanted to seal the place away. But silence doesn't erase history, it only buries it deeper. In the 1950s, local school children dared each other to sneak onto the property. They returned with stories of whispering voices, of laughter echoing through the trees. One girl claimed she saw small hands reaching up from the soil. Her parents moved the family to Georgia within a week. When modern archaeologists revisited the site in the 1970s, they came armed with equipment and skepticism. Dr. Henrietta Malone led the excavation, determined to separate myth from fact. She and her team mapped out the property, locating what they believed to be the original foundations of the smokehouse. The dig began carefully, layer by layer. Within 2 days, they found the remains of a wooden staircase descending into darkness, the entrance to the infamous cellar. Against local advice, Malone insisted on exploring it herself. The first thing they noticed upon entering was the smell, damp but strangely metallic, like rust and iron. The air was heavy, unmoving. Their lanterns flickered, though there was no wind. Along the walls, faint carvings were visible, marks resembling letters, though none matched any known alphabet. At the far end of the chamber, they found a wooden table, half rotted, covered in a fine layer of white dust. On it lay 9 small indentations, as if something had once been cradled there. They took photographs, samples, and measurements. But that night, every photograph came out distorted, faces blurred, shadows stretching across the frames. In one, a faint figure appeared behind Dr. Malone, tall, almost touching the ceiling, with eyes like hollow pits. She dismissed it as a photographic error. The others didn't sleep. 2 days later, one of the assistants fell ill. He complained of hearing whispers underground, a woman's voice repeating the same phrase, "Bring them back." By the following morning, he was gone, leaving behind only his boots and a trail of wet footprints leading to the forest. The project was halted indefinitely. The official reason: psychological strain due to environmental isolation. But in Malone's private notes, later published posthumously, she wrote, "It isn't haunted, it's alive. The ground itself is breathing her name." By then, the story of Mara, the silent giant, had become folklore taught to scare children, but some historians began to reconsider it, wondering if the tale had roots in something real. Anthropologists noted similarities between the silent mother myth and West African ancestral traditions, particularly those involving women who protected their lineage through spiritual silence, binding their souls to their children. If Mara had come from such a lineage, Breyer's attempts to control her might have unleashed forces he couldn't comprehend. Over the years, travelers continued to report strange occurrences near the old Breyer land. Drivers on the nearby highway sometimes saw a tall figure standing by the roadside, motionless, her head tilted slightly toward passing cars. When they stopped to look, she was gone. Hunters in the forest spoke of finding perfect circles of stones, 9 at a time, appearing overnight. And when they disturbed them, their compasses stopped working. One chilling account came from a man in 1987 who claimed to have found a buried journal in a hollow tree near the site. The pages, though half decayed, contained a single sentence repeated over and over: "She will speak when they are all found." The property is now fenced off, officially marked as a wildlife preservation area, though no state agency has ever claimed ownership. Locals say that if you stand near the fence at night, you can still hear it, that low, humming breath from beneath the soil. Some call it the wind through the trees. Others say it's her, still waiting, still silent, guarding what remains of her daughters. And sometimes when storms roll through Alabama and the sky turns black, lightning flashes just long enough to reveal her shape, towering among the trees, her face hidden in shadow, her silence louder than any scream ever could be. When the modern world finally forgot the Breyer name, the story lingered like smoke, thin but impossible to clear. For most people, it was nothing more than an old Southern ghost story, a relic of the cruel past that no one wanted to examine too closely. But for a few, historians, paranormal researchers, and descendants of those who once worked that cursed land, the silence of Mara and her 9 daughters still demanded an answer. It wasn't just folklore to them, it was unfinished history. In 2003, a small documentary crew from Baton Rouge set out to find that answer. The project was meant to be a short segment for a television series on America's forgotten plantations. The producer, a woman named Claire Hayworth, was known for her rational approach. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was chasing the truth behind old legends. She'd read about the Breyer plantation and believed it was a metaphor for the cruelty and superstition of antebellum America. But what she and her crew recorded over the following week would never air. They arrived in late October, when the air hung heavy with humidity and the forest was alive with the smell of rot. The locals they interviewed refused to guide them to the old property. An elderly woman named Miss Delia, who claimed her grandmother had worked there as a child, warned them in a trembling voice, "Don't go where the ground hums. That's her heartbeat. She ain't done waitin'." The crew laughed it off, though one cameraman later admitted her words lingered in the back of his mind the entire trip. The path to the plantation was barely visible now, swallowed by vines and roots. It took them hours to reach the foundation of what had once been the main house. just a cracked chimney standing alone among the trees. Claire recorded her narration there, describing the fall of the Breyer estate, the rumors of human experiments, and the story of the silent giant who bore 9 daughters no one ever saw alive. As she spoke, a low wind stirred the trees, and one of the crew swore he heard a hum beneath the sound, faint but rhythmic, like something breathing just under the soil. They dismissed it as coincidence. That night, they set up camp near the ruins. The sound returned, soft at first, then louder. The microphones caught it clearly, a deep resonance, rising and falling in perfect intervals. It wasn't wind, it wasn't machinery, it was something organic. The crew joked nervously, calling it Mara's lullaby. Claire, always the skeptic, decided they'd investigate the next morning. At dawn, they followed the sound to the old smokehouse site, now just a depression in the earth. The soil there was darker, richer, and as they dug through the top layer, they found remnants of brick and bone, small bones. The crew fell silent as the camera zoomed in on the fragments. Claire tried to keep control, instructing them to bag the remains for analysis. But as they worked, the sound began again. That same humming, now so deep it made the ground vibrate. The footage that survived, discovered later in the abandoned van miles from the site, shows what happened next. The camera shakes violently, the audio distorts, and in the distance, something moves between the trees. A tall shape. It doesn't run or sway like a person. It glides, slowly, deliberately, its head tilted as though listening. Then the screen goes black. The rest of the tape is filled with static and faint whispers, repeating what sounds like the phrase, 1 for 9. The search team that went looking for them found the camp abandoned. The tents were intact, cameras and food untouched, but every microphone wire had been pulled from its socket and laid neatly in a circle. In the center, pressed into the soil, was a single handprint, enormous, almost twice the size of a man's. The impression too deep to have been made by human weight. Claire and her crew were never found. After that, the state sealed off the area permanently. Official reports blamed environmental hazards, unstable ground, toxic runoff, unsafe terrain. But privately, locals whispered that Mara had finally spoken, and those who heard her were claimed. The story might have ended there, but in 2012, a historian named Dr. Jonah Kepler published a controversial paper arguing that Mara and her 9 daughters represented something far older than plantation history, that they were echoes of a forgotten faith. He compared her to West African deities associated with silence, mourning, and earth. In those traditions, silence wasn't weakness. It was sacred resistance, a form of communication beyond sound. Kepler's research connected Mara's story to one recurring symbol, the number 9. In West African cosmology, 9 often represented cycles of rebirth, the return of spirit through generations. His theory was that Mara's 9 daughters weren't just victims, they were reincarnations, vessels through which her silence would one day break the world's ignorance. He wrote, "Perhaps she never meant to speak in our language. Perhaps she speaks through time itself." That same year, Kepler disappeared. He was last seen driving toward the old Breyer property. His car was found days later by the fence line, doors open, engines still running. In the passenger seat lay his notebook open to a single page. It read, "I heard her. It's not a hum. It's words, stretched thin. She's still calling." Their names. Today, the land remains untouched, officially listed as conservation property. No one is permitted entry without state clearance, though even the rangers avoid patrols there after dark. Locals claim the hum still comes and goes with the seasons. In summer it's faint, just a tremor beneath the soil. But in autumn, around the time of the harvest, when the air grows damp and the moon turns red, it becomes unmistakable. Farmers miles away have reported feeling it through their boots, like a pulse in the earth. Those who live nearest say strange things happen. To sound near the fence. Voices echo twice. Birds go silent mid-song. And if you stand very still, they say, you can hear something beyond the hum. The faint murmur of a woman's voice, layered beneath the earth, speaking in a language no one recognizes, Some claim she's calling for her children. Others say she's warning the living not to disturb her rest. Every few years, a trespasser ignores the warnings and slips through the fence. None have stayed long. They always return pale, trembling, unable to describe what they saw. One teenager who dared to film a video there uploaded only a few seconds before deleting his account entirely. The clip showed a patch of earth rising and falling as though something underneath were breathing, and a faint, impossibly tall shadow stretching across the trees, even though the sun was behind it. The old county clerk once said something that locals still repeat when the night grows too quiet. There are places where silence is louder than screams. That land was one of them. And perhaps that is why Mara's story endures. Not because of the terror, but because of what that silence means. A silence born not of submission, but of defiance. The silence of a woman whose suffering was so immense it bent the world around her, leaving echoes that centuries cannot erase. They say when the wind moves through those trees now, it carries more than sound. It carries memory, whispers of 9 small voices returning home, and a mother's vow that no one will ever take them again. The hum beneath the earth remains, steady and eternal, a heartbeat trapped in soil. Some call it a curse. Others call it justice. But all agree on one thing. Mara still waits. And one day, when the world grows quiet enough to hear her fully, she will finally speak. And when she does, the truth buried beneath that Alabama earth will rise with her. Before you leave this story behind, ask yourself, how many other truths like this one were buried beneath the dust of history, never spoken, never recorded, and never believed? Stories like this are not just about the past. They are about the silence that still echoes through time. The silence of those who were never allowed to speak. The silence of those whose pain became property. And the silence of those who dared to remember when the world told them to forget. If this story made you feel something, a chill, a question, a moment of reflection, then this is just the beginning. Our world is filled with forgotten voices and unspoken histories waiting to be uncovered. Every week we peel back another layer of darkness, revealing the secrets that shaped the world you live in today. Secrets they never wanted you to know. Subscribe now, because the next story may hit closer to home than you think. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt, what you believe happened to the 9 daughters, and whether you think justice ever truly found its way to those who took everything. Your thoughts, your questions, and your curiosity, keep these stories alive, and together we bring light into the shadows of forgotten history. So don't just watch, be part of this search for truth. Subscribe, comment, and join us, because the silence is finally breaking.